Welcome to The Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others. Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Studios, Rochester, New York, mouth off at RockVox, rockvox.com. Having enjoyed an almost 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, Executive and Recovery Coach, Keith Greer.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your day to sit in with us on this episode of The Helping Conversation. Those of you who have been loyal listeners to this podcast since I started it earlier this year know that one of the buzzwords for me is evidence-based. I, as many of you know, have spent a great many years working in the world of substance use disorder treatment and recovery. And I would argue, and I like to say that as someone who's been in the field as long as I have, that affords me the right to be a bit critical. That one of the things that has happened in my specific corner in the world of substance use disorder treatment and recovery is, to this day, there are corners that are still very, very guilty of using practices that have no evidence behind them. And that if you were to have a conversation with the practitioners, they would say, well, this is just what we've always done. And we see that turn up in the continued use of stigmatized language. We see that turn up in treatment programs that still absolutely over-rely on 12-step philosophies, which don't get me wrong, for many, many people, 12-step philosophies have been a godsend, but it's not an evidence-based practice. And so this is a really important conversation in any corner of the world where people facilitate some type of helping conversation. Are you practicing something that at the end of the day, you can point to some piece of research, some piece of evidence that says this is where this modality or model will work, under what circumstances, with what type of clientele, and oh, by the way, what kind of training and expertise do you need to have to facilitate it? So it is a very important conversation in all corners of the helping world. And today we're going to dig into a very specific corner that is near and dear to my heart. As you all know, that up until a few years ago, I spent a wonderful, blessed 30-year career as a school social worker. And so let me tell you a little bit about who our guest is today, and we're gonna jump right in. Dr. Jim Raines calls himself an accidental academic with the heart of a practitioner. We're definitely going to ask him about that, what that means. He earned his master's in social work at Columbia University in New York City and his Ph.D. from Loyola University of Chicago. Jim has been president of the Illinois Association of School Social Workers, Midwest Council of School Social Workers, and the School Social Work Association of America. He is the author of over 50 publications. Books published by the Oxford University Press include Evidence-Based Practice in School Mental Health, School Social Work, and Ethical Decision-Making in School Mental Health, and Evidence-Based Practice in School Mental Health, Addressing DSM-5 Disorders in Schools. He has keynoted state, national, and international conferences. He was the Department Chair of Health, Human Services, and Public Policy at California State University, Monterey Bay for 6 years, and he currently serves as a professor of social work and teaches professional ethics. And I would add to this that when Jim and I first met and discussed the possibility of him coming on the podcast, I did not realize at the time that 2 of his books have been sitting on my bookshelf for quite a period of time. I never made the connection that these 2 books that are very, very well known in the world of school social work, that I was speaking to the author. So please join me in sending along a really warm welcome to Dr. Jim Raines. Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's get started a little bit on your background. I just invite all of my guests to talk a little bit about what your professional journey has been. You know, you start your bio with, you call yourself an accidental academic with the heart of a practitioner. How did you get to where you are today, having written so many articles and books on this concept of evidence-based practices?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I went to Columbia University for my Master's of Science in Social Work, and I think because it was a Master's of Science in Social Work, they tended to take that evidence-based approach a little bit more seriously than maybe some of the other MSW programs around the country at that time. And really insisted that we learn how to do research in addition to learning our clinical skills as well. And at Columbia, you had a choice of focusing on a particular population you wanted to address, as well as a particular set of skills you wanted to develop. And so for me, I really wanted to work on my clinical skills, and I really wanted to work with kids.
Yeah. So you started out in the world as a social worker doing clinical work?
Right. So my first placement as an MSW student was for kids who were aging out of foster care in New York City, 16 to 21.
Yeah.
On their 21st birthday, they got a $500 check from the state of New York and were told to have a nice life. And our job was to get them ready for that birthday. Really rough transition.
Oh my!
And then my second placement was at an inpatient child and adolescent psych unit that served 3 counties in suburban New Jersey.
Yeah. So I'm always curious with my guests. This, for some people, sounds like maybe a bit of an odd question, but I tend to be a very big believer, Jim, that it is, for most of us in the helping world, it's not a coincidence that we landed in the helping world. That it tends to be based on some ways of being that are inherent to us, came into the world with us. So I am always curious with my guests, if I knew you when you were a kid, when you were a teenager, what would have been the evidence at that moment in your life? Things you were involved in, activities, ways of being, how you came at the world, even then, that would have been evidence that you were going to find yourself in the helping world.
Well, I think it really started when I was a teenager. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, not a great part of town. And I worked in a factory for 4 years during high school. As soon as I was 14, I went to work. And my father was either absent or abusive when I was growing up. And so it was really my mother that had the responsibility of raising 5 kids on her own.
Wow.
And I knew I wanted to help kids like myself who didn't feel like they had much of a family. And really felt a little bit lost without one.
Yeah. So that was a piece of knowledge early on that I'm curious because I think a lot of times for folks who grow up maybe in the environment you did, was there an awareness even then that there were other kids out there dealing with similar home environments to yours?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember we had one kid in one of my classes when I was at junior high age, and he was actually 3 years older than the rest of the kids in class. He'd been held back that many times. Right. And he was a real bully. I mean, he was a violent bully. And but we also knew that, if you walked by his house late at night, you were probably going to be able to hear his father in a drunken rage taking out his anger at the rest of his family.
Right.
And so I became really aware that, kids didn't become bullies and violent without a background, where they had an abusive parent.
Yeah. So even then, at an early age, your ability to look at a situation like that and think systemically, this kid and this kid's behavior doesn't come from nowhere.
Right.
Yeah. So you go off to school and you decide that I want to work with kids, and we know that there, even within that population, there's a million different directions you could go in. So why school social work?
Well, interesting. I actually didn't start off with school social work. I actually started off doing youth ministry. I went to seminary after college.
Oh, wow.
Learned Greek and Hebrew, and went to work in suburban New Jersey again, and just really quickly, I mean, within a year, realized that my lack of skills uh, to help kids that were facing psychosocial issues like child abuse and substance use and domestic violence and eventually suicide. Really made me incapable of helping them in a way that I wanted to. And so I just kind of looked across the river. I realized that one of the 10 best schools in social work was in Manhattan, and I applied and I got in, and I fell in love with social work from the very first day.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Upon completing your MSW, what was next in terms of
I worked in
positions?
a family service agency in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
A really good one. They did a community and schools program. And so I worked at IS 88 in Brooklyn, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and with the kids who were labeled severely emotionally disturbed at that time.
Right.
And our job was to get them ready for high school and hopefully not to drop out from high school, because we found that actually 100% of our kids dropped out of high school before I started there. And part of it was that they would participate in this high school lottery that New York City has,
Right.
where they could go to any school in the system. And we eventually figured out that that was not a good idea for our kids.
Yeah.
Because most of our kids were gang associated, if not gang involved. And it meant they'd go down into the subway on their turf, but they'd come out of the subway on somebody else's turf. And that really put them in danger. And so they were really not capable of being able to sustain going to a high school outside of their neighborhood.
Right. Wow. So I have this memory of when I first started my career, aspects of doing this kind of work. And like you, I've spent most of my career working with teens and families. Aspects of doing this work that I just remember being so personally challenging. Both before my MSW and even after my MSW. So I'm curious, especially given these populations that you're talking about that you worked with, what do you remember being some of your greatest challenges in learning the craft of social work and working with children and families?
I think the first one was really just working in that junior high school in New York City. And, we, an African-American colleague of mine, we put together what we called a graduation group for the eighth graders. And we took them to all the high schools that they were interested in applying to. And we taught them the process. We actually took the subway with them to show them how to get to that high school. We connected them with a school social worker or school counselor at the other end that they could talk to once they were enrolled in that high school. And we went back and evaluated our results a year later. And we found that 100% of them dropped out of high school.
Yeah.
So we were just miserable failures at what we did. And then we really had to rethink our whole plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Humbling, right? Humbling.
It was very humbling.
Humbling. We all come out with that big heart. We're going to do all this good work, and to look at the data, and it didn't all add up at the end of the day. So where in your journey did you then start thinking school social work particularly?
Yeah, so I was working in schools already, and Columbia at that time actually did not have a school social work concentration as they do now. So I eventually moved to Chicago after New York City, and got a job as a school social worker working in a school, regular school, and really loved not just being sort of a professional visitor to a school, which was what I kind of view the community and schools model being, but really being part of the faculty and part of the staff and so forth, and being an insider to the school.
Yeah.
And really having a deep rapport with my principal, as well as with the teachers and so forth. And one of the things I remember my first principal required me to do, and I was working at K through 5 school at that time, she expected me to know every name of every student in that school in the first year.
Wow.
And I did it.
Yeah.
I had to do a little work on it, but she had been there for 20 years,
Yeah,
right? So
right.
she really did know
Yeah,
every kid in her school.
yeah,
But she expected me to do that in the first year, and I mastered it, and she appreciated the fact that I worked so hard on it.
yeah,
But I love being the insider person,
yeah.
and that's really I think began to piece together what evidence-based practice might look like in a school.
Right.
So I began doing multi-tiered systems of support long before anybody ever talked about that in
Okay,
the
so
literature.
for the non-social school social worker listening, define what you just said.
So what I mean by multi-tiered systems of support means that you are tier one is basically doing universal prevention for kids,
Right.
so they don't have the problems that you want to try to address. Tier two is doing sort of second level prevention for kids that are showing some signs of those problems, but hopefully you can hit those with early intervention and keep them out of deep trouble. And then the third tier is really working in depth with kids that really have a full blown problem that needs intensive intervention.
Right. 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 So
And so
intervention.
what I did Yeah. So what I do for tier one is I realized very quickly that the first 10 weeks of the school year were relatively low key. And it was kind of before school report cards hit,
Right.
because once school report cards hit, the proverbial shit hit the fan. Pardon my expression there. But and so I could be in every classroom every week doing primary prevention. And I remember my director of special ed would ask me about week 5, how many kids have you seen this week, as a social worker? And I'd say, well, I saw the whole school. I saw 500. And her mouth would drop open. And I said, well, I'm in every classroom every week.
Right.
And the thing that I noticed as I was doing this prevention stuff is that, the teachers started off by using it as a resource period where they could go and prep for the next section of class. But they got so hooked by what I was doing with their students, they actually began to stay in the room.
That's wonderful.
And that was a really cool thing, because then they could then prompt the students about things that I was teaching the students, which really helped integrate it into the classroom routine.
Yeah. I'm curious, in today's world, because I know, over the generations, language changes. In today's world, would those tier one interventions be looked at as all the different things that a building might do around school climate? So it's directed at every single student around general school climate, how we treat each other, things like that.
Right. So, first grade, I would do a feelings curriculum.
Yeah.
Second grade, I would do a friendship curriculum,
right.
Things like that. I forget what I did for third grade, but fourth grade, I do, stress management, things like that. So, these are kind of universal social emotional skills that I was trying to teach the students. And not always having a great curriculum to do it. Sometimes I was left to my own devices, but I was pretty clear that all kids needed social emotional skills to get them through life and to get them through school.
Yeah. And still do to this point. To this point
Absolutely.
in time, maybe even a little bit more so these days.
A lot of adults do too.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's true. Yeah, that's true too. In those days, in the work you were doing in the school, what work were you doing with parents?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would do, and I recommend this to everybody, and again, this is probably a tier one approach, is once a year I would, or at least maybe once a semester, I would actually meet with the PTA. And I'd explain just what my role was in the school, because most people had no idea. Most people thought that, if I had to deal with their kid was in deep trouble.
Right.
And I said, a social worker is really there to help your kid learn to get along with other people.
Yeah.
And to the degree that I can do that, I'm only more glad to work with your kids and to have your permission to do so.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first step in terms of working with parents. And then I also recognize that, there are certain problems for which counseling does not help. And one of them is for kids with ADHD.
Yeah.
Counseling really doesn't help a kid with ADHD. And I occasionally see on social media somebody posting in one of the school social work groups that, my principal wants me to work with these ADHD kids. I don't know what to do. And I go, well, maybe you shouldn't be working with the kids. Maybe you should be working with their parents. And because what parents need to do is learn how to do parent behavioral training.
Yeah. Right.
And that's an evidence-based practice.
Right.
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 And if parents can do that and teachers can do that, and you can get them to reinforce the same set of rules at home as well as at school, and have them have a schedule at home just like they do at school, you can internalize some structure for these kids,
Right.
and they can succeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you added the part about the classroom, because ADHD is one of those conditions where, if we really want to be honest, we have to look at the systems issues, the environmental issues, and stop just looking at 7-year-old Johnny and saying, "Would you please sit still?"
Right. Well, part of it was my firstborn son was mildly sort of ADHD.
Yeah, I got one of those
but he
too,
was also
Jim.
born with a congenital heart defect, which meant he could not be on that stimulant medication that they so often put kids on.
Yeah.
And so I've always been a believer that kids need two things to succeed in life. One is nurture, and the other one is structure. And kids can put up with as much structure as they get nurtured. And if you give them an equal measure, kids will be fine. And so when my kid came home from school, he had a half-hour schedule every half hour that he had to do something different. And the first half hour was usually to have a snack with his dad.
Yeah.
And I'd feed him a snack. We'd talk about his school day, and then he was supposed to, start homework and things like that. And I remember, and he really internalized the schedule, so he knew when the clock hit that half hour, he was supposed to transition to the next activity.
Yeah.
And I remember one time he had a band concert coming up, and he, wasn't sure he was ready for it. And I said, why don't you practice your trumpet a little bit more so you can feel more confident before the concert? He goes, I can't practice my trumpet, Dad. It's not 7:00 yet. And I realized that he had completely
Don't mess with my schedule. Yeah.
the structural system that I'd put in place, because he was rigidly, holding on to it.
Yeah. Yeah, look, and again, as somebody who just left the school 3 years ago, this issue around working with students with some form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I say this with great love in my heart for the system that I worked in for all those years, but the system is still not always very sensitive to that issue, from everywhere from downplaying it to not really understanding the neurology of it. And not appreciating the systems component of what we need to do to intervene and support. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. So where in this process did you decide to leave doing some of this more direct clinical work and move more in the direction of teaching and writing?
So it's kind of interesting. So when I was working in my doctoral program, I was given a full scholarship to Loyola University School of Social Work for their Ph.D. Primarily because I think I had done a keynote address to all of the other field instructors. They would have a once a year banquet for the field instructors at that school, and they'd asked me to keynote it one year, and I did that. And I had been a field instructor for both NYU for a couple of years, and then Loyola for 4 years. So after working in the schools for a while, um, there was a job opportunity at Aurora University, just about 30 miles west of Chicago, for a field coordinator. And I thought, well, I've been a field instructor for all these years. Maybe I could do a field coordinator position, and kind of move up into administration a little bit that way. And I went and I applied for the job. And when I showed up for my interview, the dean took me aside. He says, "Listen," he says, "we had to advertise this job externally, but we already have an internal candidate that's going to get hired.
Yeah.
And we just want to be upfront with you about that. But nonetheless, we want you to, guest teach a class and so forth." And so I guest taught a practice class, and the students were so thrilled with my guest lecture that they actually took up a petition for the school to hire me.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, I have another, closing out interview with the dean, and she says to me, the students really liked you, and we have a professor that's going on sabbatical next year. Would you be willing to come as a visiting instructor for a year? And so for the next 6 years, I was a visiting instructor for somebody going on sabbatical, and while I was finishing my doctorate. So it was actually a terrible place to work. The workload was really, really heavy.
All right, so you did your time as a school social worker, doing some pretty significant work, and you marched off into the land of secondary education. And so let's talk a little bit more about the specifics of your area of expertise, evidence-based practice. Let's just start with how you would even define that term.
Yeah, I think in the simplest of terms, I define it as what works for most people empirically. And I always say there are two corollaries to that. The first one is that what works for most people will not work for others. And the second corollary is that what works for most people sometimes makes other people worse. And so I think the importance of clinical wisdom is knowing when to pull the plug on an evidence-based practice,
okay,
and to try something else or go to a plan B.
Right. So that's a key point, that just because a practice is evidence-based does not mean that is going to work, and as you just said, could actually make a situation worse.
Right.
Yeah. And so there's that place for our clinical judgment above and beyond whatever the specific evidence-based practice is. So if it's what works for most, won't work for everybody, could make it worse for some, then at the end of the day, within, and now we're moving into an area where my level of knowledge is thin. In the world of research, then what do researchers need to see to be able to say this is an evidence-based practice?
I think, when I first started reading the research, I would sort of be like a lot of people, and I would jump to the results section and then read the discussion
oh
section
my, am I
first,
guilty
right?
of that?
And then I realized, wait a minute, I really need to look at the methods section first. I need to know who they tested this on.
Right.
And I need to know, first of all, do the people they tested it on look anything like my clients? The most over-researched group in the world are white suburban university students taking an intro to psych course. And they don't look a whole lot like, your modern K through 12 student in terms of demographics at all. And so, you really got to take some things with a grain of salt, depending on who they've been tested with and whether they've been tested just in a sort of university laboratory setting, or whether or not they've been tested in the real world. And I remember when I wrote my book with Mike Kelly about school social work, one of the things we did in that book was we insisted that any evidence-based practice we recommended in that book had to have been tested in a school setting.
Oh.
And we found that got rid of about 80% of the research.
Really?
and it was just phenomenal. So, in terms of thinking about who the client is and who the participants in the research are is really important. And so, what I want to know is who do they try this on, and then I think it's also incumbent, and this was in my first book on evidence-based practice, that we then, if it doesn't look like our population, to go ahead and modify or adapt the evidence-based practice so that it more fits with our population.
Right, right.
And so as soon as you adapt an evidence-based practice, now you've created something that's not evidence-based anymore. And so what you really need to do then is do a routine evaluation of your own work.
Okay.
Just like my colleague and I did back in Brooklyn.
Right.
we ran a 10-week group for graduating 8th graders, and we went back a year later and said, okay, did it really work?
Yeah.
And we found out that we were miserable failures. But it kept us from repeating our error.
Yeah.
And so you just have to get into the practice of constantly evaluating your own work.
Yeah. So as you said, if you in any way modify an evidence-based practice, kind of next level thinking as I'm listening to you is do I, as a practitioner and a professional, have the courage and maybe the ethical backbone, so to speak, to do what you and your colleague did? All right, let me go back and do my own evidence gathering, and was this successful or not?
Right.
Yeah. Which I'm thinking in a lot of places doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of people rely on a satisfaction survey or something like that to determine, and honestly, I will tell you, our graduation group was enormously popular with the kids and with the teachers and with the school administration. They all loved our program.
Because they graduated, yeah.
But at the bottom of the line, we needed to know whether or not kids finished high school or not.
The bias you just mentioned, Jim, about so much research being done on, kind of white male college kid. Does that bias still exist in the world of research around evidence-based practices?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still there. Most people that are writing, and this is why I call myself an accidental academic with the heart of a practitioner. Most people that write in the research journals are academics writing to other academics.
Yeah.
And I have never done that in my life. As an academic, I write to practitioners. I write to people that are on the front lines because I've been on those front lines.
Right.
And I know the limitations of working in a real K through 12 setting.
Yeah.
So, I don't, I occasionally run into an article written from one academic to a bunch of other academics, and even I have trouble understanding what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I was just reading one today, in fact, and I was thinking, my God, this is complicated. They could have toned it down and used more everyday examples and things like that, but they just couldn't go there.
Yeah. A few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I'm blanking on the exact time. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation came out with this. They had done some kind of 50,000 foot research on the current state of adolescent wellness. I don't know how well the research was done or not done, but there was a part at the end of their report that has stuck with me. And I think it speaks a little bit to what you were just talking about. What they talked about, the authors of the report talked about towards the end, is that the world, in terms of practices that can be helpful to adolescent wellness, the world of research, the world of practice, and the world of legislation, none of them ever talk with each other. And because of that disconnect, it holds back bringing what we might learn about in a research setting and really bringing it into the world of practice. And then, the larger systems issue of law and policy and things like that. You find that to be true?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a giant disconnect there.
Right. In fact, you had a comment. I had looked through your book, your evidence-based practice in school mental health. you had a comment in here that really blew me away. It was under the kind of in the chapter that talked about systemic issues with evidence-based practice. And you said research indicates that it can take up to 20 years before clinical research becomes translated to clinical practice.
Yeah.
It's that long?
It's that slow. What's amazing is that some of the real original research that I found in this was in my first edition of the same book, and I found that the British Navy knew that fresh fruits and vegetables were really important for keeping sailors from getting rickets and things like that
Right.
on the high seas. And they knew that 100 years before they decided to load limes into the British ships to keep British sailors healthy. And that's why British sailors were often called limeys. But it took 100 years from the point of view of finding out that fresh fruit could, keep rickets from happening to sailors because of a lack of vitamin C before it became systemic throughout the British Navy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, while that time gap has increased, in terms of gotten faster, I should say, it's still a long way off.
Yeah. That stat about 20 years, that's a generation. That's a generation of students, right? From if you think about kindergarten to graduation, that I enter kindergarten, there's knowledge out there about how to help me, but it's not going to wind up in the hands of my school social worker until I'm a couple of years after I've graduated.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of people's fault. I think honestly, one of the promises I made to myself when I graduated from Columbia was I wanted to read an article or a chapter a day that was related to my practice. And I have kept that up for the last 35 years now since I graduated. And so I'm a voracious reader,
right?
But I'm always reading something new, and I'm always reading something that, I'm trying to apply to some kind of real life situation. So I think part of the problem is that we supposedly want people to keep up with, continuing education. But a lot of people don't do it unless they're required to.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think that the other fault is with academia. One of the suggestions I make when I speak to audiences about evidence-based practice is, I ask them to raise their hand if they're an alumni of some, school of social work, and of course, everybody raises their hand. I go, how many of those schools told you should have a lifetime approach to improving your knowledge and skills? And they all raised their hands. I said, now, how many of those institutions told you could still access their library databases after you finished? And nobody raises their hands.
Yeah, right. Not unless I make $1 million
donation. So the next time your alumni association contacts you about a donation,
there you go. Right.
You know what to say.
Yeah. Right. Right. No, you're done with your MSW. You're done unless you want to pay some significant money.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That I don't know that of every sentence in this book, Jim, that sentence took my breath away of that 20-year time period. Yeah. All right. So I'm a big school system, and I am considering trying to bring more evidence-based practices into my school, or to become system-wide, more evidence-based in how we go about things. In your book, you list 5 major reasons for engaging in evidence-based practices. Could you talk a little bit about those reasons?
Yeah, well, I think for me, the biggest one is the ethical one, right?
Right.
And it's sort of the golden rule philosophy, right? That goes all the way back to the Torah, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you treat other people the way you want to be treated. Yeah. And so to me, that's the number one thing. I remember talking to one of the fathers of evidence-based practice. He was in Wisconsin, and I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but Len Gibbs. And Len Gibbs wrote the first book on evidence-based practice in social work. And most people didn't know, but Len Gibbs was dying at the time he wrote it. He was dying from prostate cancer. And he realized that he wanted the doctors to use the most evidence-based practice they could to treat his prostate cancer.
Right.
And yet he realized that, for a lot of his professional life and so forth, he didn't really expect that to be used for clients.
Yeah.
And then he began, he put together this wonderful questionnaire, which would basically say, okay, how much do you want your doctor to use an evidence-based practice when treating your illness? And how often do you use an evidence-based practice when treating a client? And of course, there was a huge disconnect.
Yeah.
And so Len Gibbs was really the one that, sensitized me to that ethical issue of why doing it. But of course, there are legal reasons for doing it, and there are clinical reasons for doing it. I think in that first book I had identified that there were like 550 evidence-based treatments for kids, just K through 12. Your average social worker might be able to name 10 of them. And so there's lots of evidence-based practices out there. It's a question of, getting them to the hands of practitioners and knowing what to do. I often just say that, your average individualized education program assigns a kid to weekly counseling. And weekly counseling is like going to the doctor and getting a prescription for 2 aspirin a day.
Right.
It won't hurt you, but it's probably not going to help you either.
Yeah.
And so I've begun to respell weekly counseling as WEAKLY rather than weekly counseling.
Yeah, weak.
The way most people say it.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, that's the truth. You have a kid coming back, let's say from an inpatient psych unit like the one I used to work on.
Right.
Would you really want to just see that kid once a week?
Yeah.
All the evidence says, hey, you should be seeing this kid 2 to 3 times a week.
Right. And what are you doing in those 2 to 3 times a week? Other than sitting and just, checking in how you doing, kids. So, much more than frequency is what exactly is happening in your room, in your work with the kid.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I was struck under the clinical reasons of the reasons for engaging in evidence-based practice. Because again, as I started the podcast today, talking about some of my background in the world of addiction, is this issue of iatrogenic impact, right? That we can actually sometimes cause harm with the treatment modalities we're using. And in some ways, you talked a little bit about that with the whole ADHD thing. I've stopped trying to talk kids, just counsel ADHD out of kids, when maybe the harm of that is it gives a pretty negative message to that child, and it's not a very realistic
somehow
message.
It's their fault.
Right, like their fault. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the last reason you give in your book for engaging in this is the economic reasons. Again, you quote some of your own research, where the greatest threat to the provision of school-based and related services has to do with state and national budget cuts. So now we're talking about a much bigger systemic issue of, pardon my expression, but do we really give a shit about kids in this country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a huge thing. And of course, with reduced state collection of income taxes over the last year, and reduced collection of sales tax over the last year, gasoline taxes, things like that, that state budgets are going to be hit hard.
Huge.
As a result of the pandemic last year.
Yeah.
I remember keynoting the SWA conference in 2010, and they wanted me to give the closing keynote for the conference. I was in St. Louis that year, and what I was seeing across the states was school staff being laid off by the dozens. if not hundreds,
Right.
depending on the size of the district, because of the recession of 08, 09. And so the state coffers were a year behind what was going on in the stock market in terms of impact. And so people were losing jobs left and right. And I predicted a lot of pain, and people weren't very happy with my closing keynote, but it was absolutely true, although I did say that in another year, I thought things would be back to, normal.
Right.
That 2010 was a sad year for school budgets. And I think 2021 and 22 are going to be sad years for school budgets.
Right.
So if you're going to do something, you might as well be as economic in your use of time and energy and resources as you can. And evidence-based practice is one way to do that.
Right. You have a definition in the book that another definition I really enjoyed of a definition of what is an evidence-based practitioner. So I'm going to quote here: placing the client's benefit first. Evidence-based practitioners adopt a process of lifelong learning. You were just talking about that involves continually posing specific questions of direct practical importance to clients, searching objectively and efficiently for the current best evidence relative to each question and taking appropriate action guided by the evidence.
Right, and that comes right out of Len Gibbs.
Yeah.
So Len was the master. I mean, he really was, and it's too bad he's not around. And I remember I got a review of my first book one time that said, evidence-based practice is kind of a theory that hasn't been proven yet. And I sent the review to Len, and I said, Len, how should I respond to this? He goes, it's like somebody questioning the scientific method.
Yeah.
That the scientific method hasn't been proven yet.
Right.
Well, it's the scientific method. That's
right.
the way it works. It's trial and error. So, it's just kind of a funny thing. But yeah, I think it's what kind of practitioner do you want to be, and what kind of helper do you want to be?
Right.
One of the things I found out when I wrote my first book was this wonderful meta-analysis of the research that said that 40% of what helps clients get better are the strengths that you can harness to improve their situation. 30% was due to the relationship of trust and empathy and concern that you develop. 15% was an expectation of hope that things could get better. And then the last percentage, which was 15%, was using the right technique.
Right.
And people would hear that and they go, wait a minute, you spent a year writing a book and it's only 15% of what helps people get better? And I would say to them, I said, every student knows what 15% means. 15% is the difference between a C+ and an A-.
Yeah.
What kind of social worker do you want to be?
Right.
There's a lot of C+ helpers out there.
Yeah.
And I used to be one of them. And I don't want to be that C+ social worker anymore. I'd rather be an A- social worker.
Yeah. What was the first percentage, Jim?
40% was due to the strengths.
Was helping
30% was
identify
relationship.
client strengths? Identifying client strengths.
Client strengths, yeah.
Client strengths, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
and
awesome.
I always remember a little acronym by Clyde Graybill on this. He wrote a wonderful acronym he called it ROPES. And it's the resources, opportunities, possibilities, exceptions, and solutions that clients bring.
Yeah. I also so appreciate the 15% that is in there that we call hope. Right?
Yeah. And I have a very different definition. I think of hope. I think a lot of people equate hope with false reassurance.
Yeah. Right.
And having had a kid that has had to have 4 heart operations between the time he was 5 and 22, I can't tell you how many hours I spent in a pediatric surgical waiting room hoping my son would come out alive.
Yeah.
And so many well-meaning friends and family members would say, "Don't worry, Jim, everything will be fine." And I'm like, "You can't know that."
You don't know that.
and so don't give me that false reassurance.
Yeah.
And so I began to realize that when people couldn't handle my pain,
Yeah.
they gave me a platitude.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I define hope like this, is that even though your problems are severe and they've been around a long time, I believe that working together, we can make things better.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And so it's about possibility and partnership. It's not about false reassurance.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm sure you do. Do you know who Brene Brown is?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So she has this fabulous, it's about a 5-minute video. You can find it on YouTube. It's a cartoon, but it's voiced by her. And it's the difference between sympathy and empathy. And when I train coaches, we show this all the time, that what you were just talking about, those platitudes are kind of in the sympathy realm versus empathy, which is a moment of shared emotion. And if I'm really going to a place of empathy, I'm not going to say to you with your son in surgery, "Oh, Jim, everything will be wonderful."
Right.
Because there's such a disconnect there between that statement and where you're at as a human being and specifically as a father in that moment.
Right.
Yeah. I had a supervisor many years ago, Jim, when I was practicing as a family therapist, who used to always say to me, in a 50 to 60 minute family therapy session, you have one responsibility and one responsibility only, and that is somewhere a 30 to 60 second interaction that engenders hope. And that all the other stuff, yes, you want to be competent and you want to be using good practice, but that piece, what she always tried to drive home, was that piece about engendering hope at a time when people are struggling. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, because most people come to a mental health professional last.
Yes.
After they've tried everything else, right? And so their hope is almost nil.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
And so you really got to start off with hope.
Yeah.
And that's why it doesn't mean underestimating their problem.
Right.
But it does mean possibility and partnership.
Yeah.
And I always say, listen, I'm an expert on problem solving, but you're the expert on your problem.
Yeah. Right.
And this is why it's going to take two of us.
Yeah. That's awesome. All of that, this formula you just laid out, leads to my last point. I notice we're getting close to the end here, is that you have this piece in your book about the science and art of therapy. And of course, that caught my eye because the name of the podcast is the practice, art, and science of the helping conversation. And that, in that you talk about clinical practice as an art because the interpersonal relationship evolves like a dance that is more emotional than logical. And I just love the fact that in this book that is talking about evidence-based practice, you still come back down to this piece of what we do is helping people that is truly artistic and creative and unique to each of us in how we make that come alive. Yeah.
One of the things that I try to drill into my interns and students is for them never to change the topic in a conversation with a client.
Yeah.
But be comfortable when a client changes topics. And the thing I tell them is when a client changes topics, they never really do.
Yeah.
There's always some thread that connects topic number 1 to topic number 2 to topic number 3. And your job is to find that thread that connects them.
Right.
Just like a thread in a tapestry.
Right.
And that's the art of therapy. Or the art of helping is finding that thread that runs through a person's life. I was speaking to someone that I dearly love this past weekend, and we recognized that a real theme in her life has been shame. She was ashamed of her immigrant parents growing up. She was ashamed of her best friend because in junior high because her friend didn't use deodorant at a point where she should have, and then she was ashamed of even some of her romantic partners, even though they were good people, and afraid, and so it was just sort of this life motif for her
right.
that just ran throughout, really a 50-year, period. It was just kind of remarkable how long that ran through.
Yeah.
So finding that red thread for people, I think, is really artistic and requires understanding the dance that people do.
Yeah.
And understanding how people change you as the clinician or the helper
Right.
in that relationship.
Right. Right. Which also, at the end of the day, for those of us in this profession, really puts an onus on our own level of self-awareness, our understanding of self, what we bring into the room, just from our own lives when we walk into the room. That interplay between where we end and our client begins, and that intimate space where this helping conversation takes place it's complex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Jim Raines, thank you.
Thank you for
this
having
has
me on.
Been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Hits home. I have a daughter who in May finished her MSSW, and her professional goal, although she is not there yet, is to do school social work and be in that environment. And I didn't ask you this, so I'm going to ask you this really quickly, even though we're towards the end, because you talked about from the moment you entered the school system, you felt very welcome there. But I also I wanted to be curious with you about some of the challenges of being a mental health person in an environment that is not inherently, nor was it built to be a mental health environment. What was that like for you?
I think helping people understand that in the most fundamental terms, right? I always say there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people with problems, and there are people that admit they have problems. And so, we all have problems, and whether you want to call that a mental health problem or not makes no difference.
Yeah.
I'm just there to help with problems.
Yeah.
And to show people that I not only care about them, but I can actually help them get better.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But you also have to have a support group, because a lot of times you are the only mental health professional in that system. And so, we used to have within the district, the larger district, a meeting of all the mental health professionals, just for the camaraderie, if nothing else, of being able to talk about what was going on in our individual schools.
Yeah, yeah. I was blessed. The district I work for had by comparison, even in our area, a large mental health team district-wise, and it was district-wide. I'm sorry, and it was such a source of support for all of us. Yeah, yeah. If folks are interested in getting a hold of your books, what's the best way to do that? Where would you send them?
Amazon's got all of my books up there. Otherwise, oup.com/US has got all of my books. They're my publisher, and they've been my publisher since, 2008, I guess.
Okay. And if folks were just interested in getting in touch with you and having a conversation with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so the best way is just to simply email me at jraines@csumb.edu.
Awesome. And I will make sure for those, as always, whatever platform you happen to be listening on, please check out the show notes, and I will have that contact information for Jim. If you are interested in exploring this, if you are a district or other folks who work, especially with children and families, he is the man about this topic and can lead you in the right direction systemically and organizationally, as well as individually. If you are just a sole practitioner who is curious about how to build more evidence-based practice into your work. So again, Dr. Jim Raines, thanks so much. I so appreciate you making the time.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. So folks, thank you again for joining us today and being a part of this conversation with Dr. Jim Raines. I hope you found the conversation helpful and thoughtful and a bit enlightening about some of the science and the evidence that is actually behind this work that we do as helping people. I hope that you're able to make some time in your schedule to join us for the next episode of the Helping Conversation. as we continue to shine a light on the skill and talent of those individuals that invite another into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the helping conversation. Everybody have a great day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the helping conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the helping conversation.